Hello and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about recycling matter on Earth. So first things first, how is matter recycled on Earth? Something that you probably either heard in chemistry class or maybe in like 7th or 8th grade science. It's called the law of conservation of matter. So the law of conservation of matter states that mass or matter is neither created nor destroyed, it just changes its form. So you can kind of think of it like a big recycling bin, right? There's a certain amount of carbon, a certain amount of nitrogen, a certain amount of hydrogen and oxygen. And so they're just kind of like, recycled through different compounds chemically. So, you have carbon dioxide, for example, and water. So carbon dioxide has CO2, is made out of CO2, has carbon and oxygen. Water, H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. Well, we can rearrange that and put that into something called glucose, which is this chemical formula here, right? And if we really wanted to, we could then, take that and make carbonic acid, let's say. And so you can kind of just take, the building blocks, the little red, gray, and white circles, and stick them together in different ways. And over the course of the entirety of these chemical reactions, the amount of carbon stays the same, the amount of oxygen stays the same, and the amount of hydrogen stays the same. That's the law of conservation of matter. So let's go through some of the major cycles. So the first cycle, and probably the most important cycle, is the carbon cycle. So the thing about the carbon cycle is it's pretty complicated, and there are a lot of like little individual steps. So if you want to take something like environmental science or AP environmental science, then the carbon cycle is one of the primary things that you'll be looking at chemically. First things first, though, some of the basics of the carbon cycle. Animals, so us, right? We release CO2, that's what we breathe out, and then plants use that CO2 in a process that we'll talk about later on called photosynthesis, and it's a part of photosynthesis called carbon fixation. So dead plants and animals, we decay, and eventually we can get turned into fossil fuels. And notice it's in quotes like that. Fossil fuels are things like oil and coal, which then, what we end up doing is kind of either digging it if it's coal out of the ground, or kind of making a pipeline or something, or a spigot, and then you end up with oil. And so all of that kind of trapped carbon will get burned, and then it will release more CO2 into the atmosphere. In addition to that, CO2 can enter water, and so when it enters water, it makes something called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid, because it's an acid, will weather away things like rocks. And some of the things that it weathers away will actually be released into water, and that can be used as kind of a nutrient source. In addition to that, these nutrients can combine together to make things called calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is commonly known as limestone. You've probably seen it before. It's like kind of these white rocks. And so limestone, or calcium carbonate, I guess I should say, are used by certain types of animals that live in the ocean that have shells typically, things like clams. Coral is another good one too. A lot of mollusks kind of use that. And that's just a brief overview of the carbon cycle. Next cycle, oxygen cycle. So the oxygen cycle is a little bit simpler. Again, we breathe out CO2 and plants use that CO2, right? So the oxygen cycle is kind of the opposite. Plants make O2 through photosynthesis, and then we use that O2 to make energy. And so an important thing to kind of note is that O2 levels, so oxygen levels, have been decreasing for the last 200 years or so due to deforestation, right? And so here we have some deforestation pictures of logging in the Amazon. And so obviously if you're decreasing the amount of plants, you're going to have a negative effect on the amount of oxygen. In addition to that, O2 can kind of combine in the atmosphere with, it's called free radical oxygen, so it's just oxygen all by itself, to make ozone, which is in the atmosphere. That's O3, by the way. And then finally, O2 through oxidation, and it says other means. I mean, you really don't need to know the details of that, but O2 through oxidation can become a permanent part of certain rocks in the Earth's crust. So I say permanent because technically, nothing is permanent. That oxygen can be released. It either just takes a lot of energy to do so, or it takes kind of a long time to do that. Next up, hydrological cycle, the one that you're probably the most familiar with. That's called the water cycle, right? So the amount of water on Earth really doesn't change very much, but where it's stored can change dramatically. So we've got all of these different terms, right? You've got precipitation, you've got evapotranspiration, evaporation, condensation, all these ations, right, are words that you've probably seen or heard before. But the whole point is that really the amount of water on Earth is kind of fixed. So talk about the law of conservation of matter. It's really fixed. And so water just moves from one location to another, right? So where can water be stored? Kind of anywhere. It can be stored in the soil. Plants are made up of a lot of water. Rivers, clouds, oceans, lakes, yes, animals, we are mostly made up of water. Groundwater, and glaciers. Next up, the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle is kind of a weird one, but it's also super interesting. So most of the air that we breathe is made up of nitrogen gas, but we really don't use nitrogen gas, right? Like we breathe it in, but then we just breathe it out. So we don't really use that nitrogen gas. It has to be kind of turned into a form that can be utilized by things like animals and plants. So there are two types of bacteria that really control the amount of nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. The first are called denitrifying bacteria. And so the denitrifying bacteria convert nitrogen waste, so, pee, into nitrogen gas. And then you have nitrogen fixing bacteria and algae, and they convert that nitrogen gas into nutrients in the soil or in the water. So bacteria mostly being soil-based little microscopic guys, and then algae really being kind of slightly bigger, the green stuff, like the pond scummy stuff that you see. That would be more in the ocean, or that would be more in like a pond or a river or something. So realize that we are a part of the cycle, right? We produce a lot of nitrogenous waste, and so example of that would be like urea, in our urine. And nitrogen can also be found in a lot of other sources, things like rocks and soil. And in those situations, they're called nitrates and nitrites. Again, this isn't a chemistry class, so you don't have to know like the difference or anything, but just know like nitrates and nitrites are kind of the form of nitrogen that you see in the soil and in rocks. And then finally, these nitrates and nitrites are very easily dissolved in water for the most part, and so they can be used by algae to grow. In fact, this can create kind of like a vicious cycle where you end up like creating it's called eutrophication, and so you end up with a lot of algae just kind of like all over ponds as a result of it. But yeah, again, if you're interested in environmental science, we'll talk a lot about the nitrogen cycle. All right, our last cycle, the phosphorus cycle. So this is also another weird one. So decomposers break down dead plants and animals, and they they return that phosphorus to the soil in the form of phosphates. So phosphates are things, again, chemically that you really don't need to know like what the chemical formula is or what it means. Just know that that's the stuff that kind of decomposers turn phosphorus into. They turn them into phosphates. And so these decomposers really do play a pretty important role in food webs and in all of this stuff, because plants can then absorb those phosphates and use them to grow. Phosphorus is a micronutrient. It's something that's kind of like in a lot of things and used for a lot of purposes. And then obviously we eat phosphates when we eat plants, and then they become a part of our cells. In fact, phosphates are really important in our cells. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next unit and the unit after that. Okay, so here's kind of like a general picture of what we just talked about, but it's really just this part here, right? It's kind of just this part. Animals, plants, decomposers, that kind of bit. But there is a whole other part with rocks that aren't really like touched on a lot of the time in the phosphorus cycle. So phosphates can settle in soil and water and help plants and algae grow. So kind of similar to the nitrogen cycle, right? But also large rocks can be weathered away to make more phosphate. So a lot of rocks are made of phosphates and have phosphates in them. And so through weathering, those phosphates can kind of like run off into the water and then eventually into the soil. And that's kind of it. So each of these cycles plays kind of an important role. And like I said, if you have any questions or need any help, please let me know. That's it.